Good afternoon and welcome to IMD. I'm delighted to be joined today by Professor Shlomo Ben-Hur for the first of two webcasts drawn from his latest book, The Business of Corporate Learning. Shlomo, welcome and many thanks for being with us today.
I'm delighted to be here, Paul.
Shlomo, in your new book, The Business of Corporate Learning, you say very early on that corporate learning is at crisis point. Can you tell us more about that? How much trouble is corporate learning in?
Lots of trouble, Paul. And I feel not very comfortable saying that because I've been in this field, for so long. But if you're looking at this, in the last 10 years, the ratings of corporate learning or perceptions about corporate learning have not changed, and they remain at around 20% in terms of approval ratings by leaders and business unit heads. In fact, what is even scarier than that is that more than 50% are saying in a recent study that was conducted that they don't think that performance in their operations will be affected if corporate learning is to be eliminated. So there's really a problem that I would define as poor perceptions. But what concerns me even more than that, is the fact that we seem to be in what I would call a state of denial about this. We don't seem to be recognizing that there's actually a crisis there and that we need to do something fundamentally different about this. And it's not that there's not a lot of activity. If you're looking at what's going on in the field, there's a tremendous amount of experimentation that's going on. But what seems to be is that we are either not conducting the right changes or we're not doing enough of them. So I think we need to really move from something like 10% to 400% in terms of improving the credit ratings of corporate learning in organizations.
So Shlomo, one of the things you mentioned at the beginning of your book is the need to think rather more in terms of behavior change than corporate learning. Are you saying, should we be abandoning the term corporate learning altogether?
Well, ideally, if we could have done that, that would have been useful, but I think that would be too radical of a step. What is important is to say we've become hostage to the traditional terminology that we use when we talk about corporate learning. Because traditionally, we would start gravitating towards thinking about this in the context of academic learning. And academic learning, if you think about this, is really focused on acquisition of skills, acquisition of knowledge, and skills. That for me is what academic learning is all about. It's about really focusing on the input. That the teacher provides. And really focusing on what is the information that we want to communicate and how do we do this. But if you really focus on corporate learning in the true sense of what we're trying to accomplish, it needs to be focused on output. It actually is about what value does this bring to individuals and organizations. And to some degree, in spite of the fact that academic learning is very important, when you're thinking about technical training and if you're thinking about the requirements, in some of the European countries that I work in, for instance, what organizations are looking for more and more is behavioral change. That is the focus of all of what we're doing. And I would suggest that that's not just semantics. That is a whole change, in the mindset and methodology, in the way people go about this, to say we need to transition from the simple description of acquisition of knowledge to move all the way to a changing behavior, organizationally and individually.
And how does all of that play to online learning? We see online learning more and more being used as a mechanism for knowledge acquisition. How does that play out in this scenario?
Online learning is perfectly fine, if you are really focusing on the individual acquisition of new knowledge. And if that's your main focus, either in the preliminary process of leading towards a change in behavior or as part of your technical training, for instance, that is perfectly fine. But what we see organizations looking for more and more is actually the focus on changing behaviors at the individual level, at how we interact within teams, and how we act as an organization as a whole.
So if we push your thinking to its logical conclusion, in effect you're saying maybe we should be getting rid of the title Corporate Learning Officer.
Yeah, well, Paul, as funny as it is, in the ideal world, we should have called these people Chief Behavioral Change. But I don't think that would resonate too well, either by the organizations or by the individuals themselves. So I think we'll keep Chief Learning Officer, for the organizations where it is there. We'll keep the topic of corporate learning, but we need to acknowledge the fact that what we are talking about is actually about the process of creating a behavioral change for individuals, for leaders, and for the organization.
So in your book, you also say that the Chief Learning Officer, that function should be applying market forces. What exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, if we look at corporate learning, it is a market. And as such, we need to apply market forces, because if we want to have informed decisions, we really need to look at the demand and the supply and the quality of the supply that we're providing. And therefore, what we need is to really make sure that we really follow an evaluation process which is rigorous. But what is interesting about this process is that we've been talking about this and about the lack of real follow-through and evaluation, on learning events for the last 40 years without a tremendous amount of change.
And what then explains that, Shlomo? Why is it that we've been talking about this for so long, but we've made no real headway?
So here, I would suggest that it's a systemic reason. That this very people and the multiple players who have something to gain from evaluating also have something to lose from it. So the vendors who provide these kind of learning offerings are concerned about finding out that maybe some of their interventions are not working. The corporate people themselves, who are associated with the delivery of the offer, are getting concerned about being found out that maybe what they have promoted so much in the organization might not be hitting the target and meeting the demand of the business. And some of the business units, heads or leaders or CEOs, would like to tick the box and to say, we provide a learning offer, not to invest so much, in a very demanding task of actually breaking the goals of what it is that you're trying to measure into a number of very specific goals, going back and evaluating what it is that we're getting out of this and continuously making modifications. But I would argue that if we don't evaluate, we're going to end up not being in a place where we're applying market forces. So I think business has to understand that it actually carries a major risk, not just financially by making such a huge investment that is not generating the return, but actually even operationally, in thinking that we're providing tools, but those not being materialized to performance improvement.
You also seem to be arguing that the emphasis on aligning HR with business strategy and objectives has somehow got a little bit out of kilter. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, just a bit. I would say alignment with the business strategy is a very important thing. But we've kind of taken that to the extreme on the expense of some other elements. And I would say that beyond just really aligning your learning strategy with your business strategy, what is very important for us is to translate that strategic alignment into operational results. And the way we do this is by ensuring that our internal systems, our processes, our products, and our people are all aligned with the learning strategy, which comes from those business imperatives, and are also aligned amongst themselves. So there's connections between all of those. Because it's only when you're aligning all of that there's consistency that flows from the business strategy to your learning offer, to your products and services, and to the kind of people that you actually employ in the learning function to make sure that the deliverables are aligned with what you originally were set out to do. And that is why getting the learning strategy right is key. to actually make sure that they have the right people, I mean, in terms of the resources of the learning function, I mean, which is one of the things that I focus on in the book. I mean, in terms of what kind of skills, competencies, and attitude do you need to have, the kind of products that need to be aligned with your key areas of focus, the specific processes that you drive in the organization, and the overall internal systems of sort of like creating your portfolio of offerings, making sure that your positioning within the organizational chart, I mean, is appropriate to where you're driving. They have the control over these areas.
So to recap today, in essence, what we've been doing is looking at the current state of corporate learning. Next week, we're going to be thinking a little bit more strategically.
Yes. We would look at the key 5 components that are actually creating and composing your learning strategy in support of that business strategy.
Shlomo, thanks so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to interact with you, and we look forward to next week as we go more down that journey of the corporate learning strategy.
Thank you, Paul. Looking forward to it.
And thank you for being with us. We hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you next week.